Imagine just for a moment that we could transport you to a specific time and place. It's December 5th, 1936. You're standing inside the Great Hall of the Kremlin Palace in Moscow.
And the atmosphere isn't just formal, it's absolutely electric. It feels less like a government meeting and, more like a revival.
Exactly. You're surrounded by over 2,000 delegates. And it's a mix you wouldn't see anywhere else in the world at that time. You've got milkmaids sitting next to generals,
Factory workers rubbing shoulders with the Politburo.
poets, scientists, farmers, all crammed into this ornate hall.
And they are all there to vote on a document that is being hailed loudly and repeatedly as the most democratic, the most progressive legal framework in human history.
We're talking, of course, about the 1936 Constitution of the Soviet Union.
Also known as the Stalin Constitution.
Right. And let's just look at what this document actually promises, because if you read the text, it is staggering. Freedom of speech, guaranteed.
Freedom of the press.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
Religious freedom, the right to assembly, universal suffrage, the inviolability of the person, meaning no arbitrary arrests. It's all there, written in black and white.
On paper, it looks like the ultimate victory for human rights. It essentially promised that the Soviet Union was moving past the violence of the revolution and becoming a normal, civilized state.
So the vote happens. It passes unanimously. There's what the transcripts describe as thunderous, prolonged applause. People are weeping with joy. They're throwing flowers. They genuinely believe they've turned a corner. And yet,
And here comes the paradox that defines this whole era.
almost immediately, we're talking months, sometimes just weeks, the government that wrote this document begins the Great Purge. They start arresting, imprisoning, and executing their own citizens, not by the dozens, but by the millions.
It is one of history's most baffling contradictions. You have a government holding up a shield of rights with one hand and wielding a sword of terror with the other.
That is our mission for this deep dive. We aren't just recounting history, we're trying to solve a puzzle. How can a law exist on paper, be taught in schools, printed in millions of textbooks, and cited by leaders, while being completely 100% ignored in reality?
And the answer is terrifying. It forces us to rethink what a law actually is. Because, as we'll see, the 1936 Constitution wasn't broken in the way we usually think of laws being broken.
No.
It functioned exactly as it was designed to.
Which is a chilling thought.
Yeah.
So we've got a stack of source material to get through today. Historical analyses, legal theory, and some firsthand accounts that really paint the picture.
It's a heavy stack, but the insights are incredible.
Let's start with the first logical hurdle. I think this is where most of us get stuck. If you're Joseph Stalin, and you intend to rule as an absolute dictator using fear and violence, which he clearly did, why bother writing a constitution that guarantees liberty?
It seems counterintuitive, right? Why tie your own hand?
Exactly. It feels like a waste of time, or worse, a liability. Why give people a piece of paper they can wave in your face? If you're going to be a tyrant, just be a tyrant. Don't promise free speech if you don't mean it.
To understand that, you have to get out of the mindset of a Western democracy and look at the specific context of the USSR in the mid-1930s. The country was reeling.
This is post-collectivization, right?
Right. The early 1930s were a nightmare. You had the forced collectivization of farms, which destroyed the peasantry. You had the Holodomor famine in Ukraine. Massive social upheaval. The state had been running on emergency mode for nearly 2 decades. Revolutions, civil war, famine.
It was chaos. The entire system was redlining.
It was. And Stalin and his inner circle realized something crucial. You can't build a superpower on permanent chaos. They needed legitimacy. They needed to signal, both to the world and to their own bureaucracy, that the revolutionary phase was over.
So this was a rebranding exercise.
In a major way, yes. Look at the international angle first. This is 1936. The Soviets were terrified of rising fascism in Germany. Hitler is rearming. The Soviets needed allies. They needed France. They needed Britain, potentially even the U.S.
But the Western democracies were hesitant to align with what they saw as, a bloodthirsty revolutionary mob.
Exactly. You can't sign a treaty with a government that looks like it might collapse or explode at any moment. So the Constitution is basically a brochure for foreign diplomats and says, look, we're civilized. We have due process just like you. We have a parliament. We have elections.
And it worked, didn't it?
Surprisingly well. You look at the New York Times or the Manchester Guardian from that period, and there were glowing editorials. People in the West wanted to believe that the USSR was liberalizing. The text seduced them.
Okay, so it was a mask for the outside world, but what about the inside? Why sell this to the Soviet people if you're just going to arrest them?
Well, the internal motivation is even more fascinating. The sources describe this concept of political maturity.
I saw that term in the notes. Let's unpack that.
The official narrative was that the Soviet Union had achieved socialism. The class struggle was over. The enemies of the people, the aristocrats, the capitalists, they were gone. Therefore, the state could afford to grant these rights.
So the logic is, we can give you freedom of speech now because everyone agrees with us anyway.
That's close. The logic was the state and the people are now one. The Constitution wasn't a tool to protect you from the state. It was a medal of honor for the state. It was a declaration of victory.
That's a subtle but deadly distinction. In the US or the UK, we think of a constitution as a restraint. Congress shall make no law. It's a fence the government can't cross.
Exactly. That is negative liberty, freedom from the state. But the Soviet view was positive liberty, freedom granted by the state. The rights were a gift. And because they were a gift from a perfect socialist state, the logic followed that no loyal citizen would ever need to use them against the state.
So if I'm hearing you right, they wrote the law assuming nobody would ever actually try to enforce it against the government.
Or, more cynically, they wrote it knowing they had a workaround. The sources talk about the concept of gradual enforcement. Many in the bureaucracy saw these rights as aspirational goals. We're writing down where we want to be.
Like a vision board for a country. In 5 years, we'd like to have freedom of the press.
Yes, one day we will be this society. But in the meantime, if you say something we don't like, we have other ways to deal with you.
Okay, so they passed the document. December 1936, the applause dies down. The banners are hung up in the factories. Children are memorizing the articles in school. And then we hit the Great Disconnect. Because 1937 isn't a year of liberty. It's the year of the Great Terror.
It's the bloodiest year in Soviet peacetime history.
Here's the technical question I need answered. Usually, if a government wants to suspend rights to conduct a purge, they declare martial law. They say, emergency decree, rights are suspended due to the threat of spies. Did Stalin do that?
No. And this is the key insight of our deep dive. The Constitution was never suspended. It was never repealed.
Wait, so while the secret police, the NKVD, are dragging people out of their beds at midnight, the law saying you cannot be arrested without cause is still valid.
Not only valid, it's being celebrated. The newspapers are printing the text of the Constitution on the front page, while the back page lists the names of spies and traitors who've been shot.
How does a legal system sustain that level of cognitive dissonance? Legally, how did they justify it?
By creating what political scientists call a dual state.
A dual state?
Yes. Imagine two systems running parallel. On one side, you have the normative state. This is the Constitution, the civil courts, the bureaucracy that handles marriage licenses, theft, traffic tickets. That all looks normal. If you rob a grocery store, you go to a regular court, you get a lawyer, you get a trial.
And then you have the shadow state.
The prerogative state.
Yeah.
This is the domain of the security services, the NKVD.
Yeah.
They operated completely outside the constitutional framework. They didn't use the Constitution. They used the criminal code, specifically Article 58.
Article 58. This comes up in almost every memoir of the period.
It does. It's the section covering counter-revolutionary activities. And it was written so vaguely that it could cover anything.
Give us an example.
Well, the Constitution says you have freedom of speech, but Article 58 says anti-Soviet agitation is a capital offense. So you have freedom of speech unless your speech is anti-Soviet.
And who decides what is anti-Soviet?
The people with the guns. If you complain that the bread is stale, is that a consumer complaint? Or is it anti-Soviet agitation designed to undermine faith in the socialist economy?
If the NKVD says it's agitation, you're done.
Exactly. And because counter-revolution was considered an existential threat, the normal rules didn't apply. They set up troikas, three-person panels that replaced judges, no defense attorney, no witnesses, no appeals, just a quick review of the file and a sentence, 10 years or death.
It's incredibly efficient. The Constitution is essentially a decorative facade. It's like painting a window on a brick wall. It looks like a window, but you can't see through it, and you certainly can't open it.
Decorative is the perfect word. The source material refers to it as the ghost law. It haunts the society. It's there watching you, but you can't touch it. Governance proceeded exactly as if the document didn't exist, even though everyone had to memorize it.
This brings us to the human element. Because it's easy to look at this as just high-level politics or legal theory, but I want to talk about the person on the ground.
Right. The lived experience.
Let's say I'm a factory worker in Moscow in 1937. I'm a loyal citizen. I've read the newspaper. I know Article 125 guarantees my rights. The NKVD arrests me because, I don't know, my neighbor denounced me to get my apartment, or maybe I made a joke about the foreman.
A very common scenario. It was a quota system, so almost anyone could be swept up.
So I'm in the interrogation room. I'm scared, but I'm rational. I say, comrades, there's a mistake. The Constitution guarantees me a trial and legal defense. I demand my rights under Article 111. What happens to me?
You have just made your situation infinitely worse.
Why? I'm citing their own law.
Because in that context, attempting to use your rights was interpreted as evidence of guilt.
That is a mind bender. Walk me through that logic.
The logic is circular, but within the system, it makes perfect sense. The party represents the people. The party wrote the Constitution. The party also arrested you. If you challenge the arrest by citing the Constitution, you are challenging the wisdom of the party.
So claiming my innocence is an act of aggression.
Precisely. It was seen as obstructing justice. You aren't a citizen exercising a right. You are a sophisticated enemy trying to use legal technicalities to hide your treason. The interrogator would say, only a guilty man would hide behind the law. An honest man would confess and help the party.
It's a trap. The law isn't a shield, it's a trap door.
It really was. And the sources mention religious freedom specifically here as well. The Constitution explicitly allowed for freedom of religious worship. It was right there in the text.
Right, so people thought, okay, the persecution is over.
Exactly. Priests and believers thought, okay, we can reopen the churches. We can ring the bells. But the moment they did, the moment they organized a parish council or held a public service, they were arrested for organizing a counter-revolutionary cell.
You are free to be religious as long as you don't do anything religious.
Exactly. The freedom existed in the abstract, but the practice was a crime.
So what does that do to the psychology of the population? If I see the law, but I know that using it gets me killed, am I confused? Am I going crazy?
The sources argue it didn't confuse people. Soviet citizens weren't stupid. They adapted. They learned the lesson immediately. Rights that cannot be used are liabilities.
Rights that cannot be used are liabilities. That is heavy.
Think about it. If you walk past a poster of the Constitution on the factory wall, you learn to look right through it. You participate in the pretending. The government pretends to give you rights, and you pretend to have them.
It's a collective hallucination, a survival mechanism.
And that is how the system survived. It wasn't just Stalin enforcing this. It required millions of people to agree to ignore the elephant in the room. It required judges to ignore the law books sitting on their own desks. It required police officers to ignore the procedures they were trained on.
It's what some historians call hypernormalization. The absurdity becomes normal because everyone accepts it.
Precisely. And it created a society of silence. You didn't talk about the Constitution. You didn't talk about the arrest. You just tried to stay invisible.
Now, I want to pivot to something that really struck me in the research. When we learn about Soviet history, we learn about the Gulag, the 5-year plans, World War II. We rarely spend time on the 1936 Constitution.
It's usually a footnote.
Why? If it was such a huge turning point at the time, if they threw a massive party for it in the Kremlin, if they commissioned songs about it, why have we collectively forgotten it?
Because history tends to focus on things that break.
Right.
We look for the explosions, the revolutions, the coups, the 1936 Constitution. Nothing happened to it.
It just sat there.
It sat there. It wasn't torn up. It wasn't burned in the streets. It remained the supreme law of the land until 1977.
Wait, so through the entire terror, the war, the post-war period, the death of Stalin, this same document was in force?
Yes. And that makes it hard for historians to grapple with. If you focus on the Constitution, you have to admit that the legal text meant nothing. It forces you to study the absence of law, which is much harder than studying the law itself.
It's studying the negative space.
Exactly. It's easier to analyze the ideology of the personality of Stalin. But if you want to understand the mechanism of totalitarianism, you have to look at this decorative constitution. You have to look at how a state can maintain a flawless legal surface while the core is rotten.
It's the bureaucracy of evil. It's not just thugs with clubs, it's thugs with paperwork.
Thugs with paperwork who can cite Article 118 while they send you to a labor camp.
And there's an irony here that we shouldn't skip over. Who wrote this thing?
It was a committee, of course, chaired by Stalin. But the main author, the guy who did the heavy lifting on the text, was Nikolai Bukharin.
Bukharin, one of the original Bolshevik revolutionaries.
Yes, a brilliant theorist, a favorite of Lenin. He poured his heart into this document. He genuinely believed it would liberalize the Soviet Union. He thought this was his masterpiece that would save the country from tyranny.
And what happened to him?
He was arrested during the Great Purge, put on a show trial, and executed in 1938.
Executed under the very system he tried to reform with his constitution.
Exactly. He was killed by the prerogative state, while his normative state stood by and did nothing. There's no greater symbol of the failure of that document than the execution of its author.
That is tragic. So let's synthesize this. We have a government seeking legitimacy on the world stage. They write a perfect democratic constitution. They immediately bypass it using emergency powers and the criminal code. The people realize that invoking the law is a death sentence, so they play along. And history glosses over it because, well, it's just paper.
That's the summary. The law didn't fail because it was badly written. It failed because the consensus shifted to ignore it.
Which brings us to the so what, because obviously we aren't in 1936 Moscow. But this concept of a decorative law, it feels uncomfortable. It feels relevant to how we understand governance today.
It's incredibly relevant. The insight here, if we zoom out, is about how we define the failure of a legal system.
Go on.
We usually think a law dies when a judge strikes it down, or a parliament repeals it. It's a loud death, it makes the news. But the lesson of 1936 is that a law can die silently.
It dies when we stop believing in it.
It dies when the institutions decide to bypass it, and the citizens decide it's too dangerous or too futile to insist on it. The ink is still dry. The book is still on the shelf. But the law is a zombie. It looks alive, but there's no pulse.
That's a much harder thing to detect than a revolution.
Much harder. It happens in the shadows. It happens when a procedure is skipped just this once for efficiency. It happens when a rule is ignored for national security. It happens when we decide that the outcome is more important than the process.
Or when we assume that just because a right is written down, we actually have it.
Exactly. We put so much faith in the document. We treat the Constitution like a magic spell. You can't do that. It's unconstitutional.
Like the words themselves have a force field.
But words don't have force fields. People enforce laws. Institutions enforce laws. If the culture of the institutions shifts, the paper is worthless. In 1936, it's unconstitutional wasn't a defense. It was the noise you made before you disappeared.
This has been a heavy deep dive, but a necessary one. We started with the applause in the Kremlin, and we're ending with the silence of the archives.
A journey from noise to silence.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with one final thought to chew on. We've talked about the cynical leaders who wrote the law. We've talked about the historians who forgot it.
But there's one group left.
The believers. The true tragedy of 1936 isn't the lie itself, it's the people who believed the lie. There were thousands of loyal communists, people who fought in the revolution, who went to their deaths clutching that constitution.
There are accounts of people writing letters to Stalin from their prison cells.
Right, saying, there must be a mistake, the Constitution says. They truly believed that if they could just point out the law, the system would correct itself.
They trusted the decoration to be a load-bearing wall.
Yeah.
And that trust killed them.
Exactly. So as you go about your week, look at the rules and policies around you at work, in your community, in the news, and ask yourself, is this a load-bearing wall that protects me, or is it just decoration?
A critical question for any era.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and stay curious.
And stay critical.
See you next time.